Well, hello and welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Benedict Rogers, an interview series produced by Hong Kong Watch. And I am Benedict Rogers, and it's an enormous pleasure and privilege to welcome as our guest in this episode Ambassador Derek Mitchell, the former United States ambassador to Burma or Myanmar, someone who's had a long and distinguished career in foreign policy, particularly in relation to East and Southeast Asia, and currently the president of the National Democratic Institute. So, Derek Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure, Ben.
Thank you. I wondered if I could start by going straight into the situation in Hong Kong, and then perhaps during the course of the conversation, we might take a step back and look at things more regionally and thematically. But it was just over a year ago, I think, that you were in Hong Kong addressing the Foreign Correspondents Club, a club that I used to be a member of when I lived in Hong Kong. And you said these words, and I'll just quote them to you. You said, "Hong Kong is at the vanguard of a great global struggle in which millions of others are also engaged. It's a spirit that demands respect for basic values of free expression and for accountable, transparent, responsive, and representative governance that respects inherent human dignity." A year on, given everything that's happened in recent months, particularly the imposition of the national security law, the disqualification and resignation of pro-democracy legislators, the arrest and imprisonment of very high-profile activists, including not least Jimmy Lai, who was my guest on this interview series just a couple of weeks ago. Yeah. And of course, the decision by some key Democrats like Nathan Law and recently Ted Hui to go into exile. Where does the movement for Hong Kong's freedoms go from here? And what do the events of the last 18 months in particular, and especially the last 6 months, signify for freedom and democracy, both in Hong Kong, but also worldwide?
Well, those are big questions, Ben. And again, thank you for having me. Look, the state of situation in Hong Kong is obviously quite grim right now. And I think many of those who were observing what was going on were a little hopeful at the start that perhaps we can you see the people of Hong Kong coming out, not just in the thousands, but in the millions, to demonstrate that it's not just a youth thing or it's not just an elite thing, that a cross-section of the Hong Kong people, the Hong Kongers, wanted to have a voice and wanted to see the full realization of the basic law. But we had no illusions about what they were facing, that they were facing a fairly implacable Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping. So what we've seen over the past year is just more of that realization of just how little give there is in Beijing, that they don't care what the international community thinks, at least at the moment. They seem to feel like they are ascendant and they can act with impunity. They can act in the open with remarkable cheek, as it were, in this regard, and feel they can get away with it. So they have shut it down. They've shut things down. And it's extremely depressing to watch from the outside, but I think it leaves the movement in a situation of having to adapt to a closed environment now, inside Hong Kong, and therefore those who are outside the country should be fighting on. If they desire to keep the fight up, they have to do it from outside. What it's done, of course, is woken up the world, because it's happened in broad daylight. So it has sent a signal about China, further signal to those who are maybe asleep over the past decade or so, that China is something quite different than maybe they had hoped it might become. And Hong Kong has been a wake-up call for Europe and for maybe some in the United States and elsewhere. And we just simply have to look at the facts of what China really is and the signals it's sending about its values and what it wants to export to the world.
Absolutely. If you look back at the last few years, and of course this erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms has been going on certainly longer than the last 18 months, where it's intensified. We think back to the umbrella movement, the disappearance of the booksellers and other key events. If you could pinpoint one particular event where it became almost irreversibly clear what the Chinese Communist Party regime's intentions towards Hong Kong were, what moment would you cite? What was the pivotal Rubicon that they crossed?
It's hard to point to a particular moment. I think when they started talking in terms of separatists, when they were misrepresenting what was actually going on in the territory, and it's not surprising they did that. They've done that, throughout their history, or they couch or the reasonable movements in extreme terms. When they start talking about black hands from the outside, including NDI, which I am president of, we work transparently and according to law in Hong Kong for many years. We had an office there working under the basic law, to empower voices, that they had the rights, that people had rights to. When that was now couched as separatist and extreme, and that it was somehow coming from the outside, black hands from the outside, I think that was a signal that they were going to brook no dissension at all. You can go back to their document number 9, that Xi Jinping put out, where he said that any civil society, any free journalists, constitutionalism, democracy, human rights, those are all Western values that are against what China's about. So I suppose they would look at Hong Kong, where there were people taking to the streets. That must have unnerved people in Beijing about what that can cross borders, and it's crossing a line for them in terms of what they would accept at home. So any of those things, it could have been signaled by the rise of Xi Jinping, the announcement of document number 9, then the couching and the misrepresentation of what was happening as extreme, as separatist, and as being driven by black hands. That to me sent the signal that this was unlikely to end very well.
You're absolutely right to pinpoint Xi Jinping, because it does appear that things changed significantly both in Hong Kong and in mainland China since he came to power. And arguably his predecessors, although of course the Chinese Communist Party has always been repressive, arguably his predecessors were much more pragmatic and allowed a certain amount of space both in the mainland and for the first 10 years or so after the handover of Hong Kong, by and large, they seem to live up to the promises of respecting a high degree of autonomy for Hong Kong. What is it about Xi Jinping and his current leadership that you think? Why do you think they've gone in the much more ideological direction that they seem to have gone in?
Well, this is driven largely by Xi Jinping, it seems. It's not necessarily a consensus what Xi Jinping is doing, but he's playing to nationalism. He's playing to a pride of Chinese history, a sense of strengthening the Communist Party to be the leadership and brooking no dissent, back to a Maoist kind of cult of personality. And that was a choice by him to do that. And very few people expected it. And I imagine people within China did not expect it. Probably the leadership in China did not expect it. So I think it's ingrained in who he is, his own observations of what China needs, his own ideology about what China represents, his own desire to, as he says, rejuvenate the Chinese nation, which maybe was a logical step from Mao to Deng and now to Xi, in terms of regaining that pride and having that recidivist attitude to overcome legacies of history. I don't know that it was inevitable. I think it was just a matter of his own desire and drive for this kind of Chinese power. And I think it could also have been driven as well and given some space by the decline of the West, decline of the United States in the estimation of those in China, the 2008, 2009 Great Recession, that in their view, scales came down from their eyes that maybe the United States is not as 10 foot tall as we thought they were. And then I think under recent years, under Donald Trump, a sense that America and maybe the pandemic, that China gets a sense of its own self-confidence. I think it's overconfidence. I think they're learning the wrong lessons. I think they're overreaching. I think they're creating a backlash. All the things that made China, quote, successful during the Deng and post-Deng years, I believe that Xi Jinping is undermining. It's all the things that made Mao ultimately unsuccessful in developing Chinese society. But Xi Jinping and his ilk seem to think they have an opening to reassert itself and capture global leadership or global power. And I think it's not going to work well, I think, for China. Certainly not going to work well for those around China and maybe for the international community.
I know that you had quite an extensive background in Taiwan as part of your China studies, and then working in Taiwan. And Taiwan, of course, is one of Asia's most vibrant democracies. Yeah. Do you think that Taiwan is likely to be Beijing's next target now that it's effectively annexed Hong Kong? And if so, what should the free world practically do to defend Taiwan?
Yeah, that's certainly the fear. We used to say that Taiwan was the canary in the coal mine. If something happened in Taiwan, that would send a signal, not just for around China, but more broadly in the international sphere. But now we're seeing Hong Kong as unexpectedly that place that was sending a signal to the world of what China's rise means, what it truly means, what a powerful China will represent. And they have made not made it a secret in China and in Beijing that Taiwan is that last piece, along with South China Sea, and who knows, and probably other pieces. Northern Korea is considered part of China, and they have a lot of recidivist ideas about their territory. But Taiwan's the last major piece in their view to capture back. So they've been testing Taiwan. They've been flying fighter jets across the midline, running ships around the island, and otherwise sending signals through their rhetoric that they won't necessarily adhere to a peaceful approach going forward. So all of this sends a signal that yes, Taiwan is in their sights as part of this national rejuvenation and the national pride, the end of the humiliating period in Chinese history. They've always viewed Taiwan as part of that humiliation. So we all must be quite concerned about China's designs on Taiwan at some point in the future. Now, whether it's in their interest to do that in the near term for a number of different reasons, Taiwan is a much harder target. They do have defense. They do have military. They do have some respect internationally. It is viewed as not part of China, at least de facto right now, the way Hong Kong was. So it's a much harder nut to crack. But we have to be concerned that if we show a little bit of weakness or a lack of determination or commitment, that China may see a reason to go for it. And particularly if things at home go badly in China, if their economy goes bad, if there are other issues that are divisive internally, traditionally, that's when we were most concerned about things that China may do externally in order to rally people around nationalism. And Taiwan's the most nationalistic issue remaining on the agenda.
Is there more that could be done, perhaps stopping short of full diplomatic recognition, because that obviously would be a very provocative act, but stopping short of that, is there more that could be done, for example, to welcome Taiwan into the World Health Organization and other multilateral organizations?
Well, yes, where possible, Taiwan, I mean, it should anyway. They should be, because they provide public goods. They have so much to offer. I mean, look how they handled COVID-19. I mean, their health systems are great. Their civil society is outstanding. They have combined civil society and technology, a civic tech activism that has been remarkable to connect society and get information out. They are a fount of high tech manufacturing, their clean energy work, their safe cities, their smart cities efforts. I mean, they really are a first world island. They just do remarkable things and have a lot to offer the international community. And it's a shame they don't have that kind of standing. So where possible, they should absolutely be included as at best to be members, but at least observers and contributors. But if China, for some reason, blocks that, or countries, decide they can't do a run around China, there's still a lot that can be done outside of these formal institutions to bring Taiwan into the conversation. And I think the United States and Japan and Europe and all those who care about democracy, care about what Taiwan represents, care about simple global norms and global public goods that Taiwan can offer, we have to think about alternative vehicles to bring Taiwan into the conversation. And in that way, if we can make Taiwan an essential part of the solutions to global problems, it makes them a little bit of a harder target to China. If they want to go after them, they're going after the global community writ large. And I really believe we should not do China's job for it and seeing Taiwan simply through the prism of what China thinks, but see Taiwan for what it is, which is independently a fount of public good. And I think there's a lot more that we can do to integrate them as part of the solution to global problems.
Absolutely. You and I first got to know each other when you were ambassador in Burma or Myanmar during a fragile transition that hasn't lived up to everything we hoped it would be, but nevertheless is still, despite all the challenges it faces, still better than full military dictatorship that existed for decades previously. What lessons, both good and bad, does the experience of Burma over the last 10 years have to teach the movement for democracy and freedom for Hong Kong and elsewhere in the region?
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of pain and sacrifice that goes to moments of opening. I mean, you could say there was this remarkable moment in Myanmar and Burma several years back, but that was hard fought and a lot of sacrifice and death and all the rest. And I don't wish that, obviously, on anybody in Hong Kong. But it comes at a price. It's never easy. I think the other important component is the importance of the international community, that we have to keep a light shining on it. I know that the Hong Kong people and those who you mentioned who are in exile, that's their intention. I think that's also a role for those of us on the outside at NDI, but what you're doing here is really exceptional. Keep a light shining on it. Make sure the governments don't just accept it and let it go back into the shadows and accept what's going on as normal, natural, or acceptable. But I think they can play a very important role in that, and that creates some pressure, a little bit of a pressure on the government and on certainly the Communist Party. Get more information into China about it. Get the truth out is very important, because you recognize that a lot of what China is peddling is lies and falsehoods, both to their own people and to the world. I think a lot more can be done to just simply tell the truth about what Hong Kong was promised, what Hong Kong has undertaken or has withstood, the sacrifices, the demands that they asked for, which are pretty basic demands. We just want a voice. We want suffrage. There was not separatists, and persistence. And it's very, very hard. And the difference with Burma, of course, is that you're not dealing with a junta. That you're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. You're dealing with Beijing, and that's a whole different kettle of fish when it comes to power. But things can change. We thought that Burma, you and I think we knew each other years back too. We thought that Burma was hidebound, nothing was going to change. But you never know. And if there's enough stress and pressure, and make it in the interest of those in power to see that the path that they're on is destructive for their own ends, that you might see change and show that we're not against your country or you, but we simply are affirming human dignity and the rights that that everyone should enjoy. Who knows over time? But it's under this current regime, it's hard to see light. But I think all of us staying true to the cause is extremely important. Being patient and looking over the long term.
Absolutely. One of the points you made there, I think, is especially important, and that's demonstrating that there's a difference between the Chinese Communist Party and China, the country, or Chinese people. And very often the party conflates the two and portrays people like you and me as being anti-China, whereas in fact, I think both of us would say we're deeply pro-China as a country and as a people. We just want them to be free.
Yeah, and we know there are lots of people within China that are struggling for their rights, that are being abused. There's enormous corruption and injustice. The nationalism has a great power to override what is otherwise in self-interest. We see that in the United States. We see it all over the world, but we certainly see that in China. And the people of Hong Kong were promised certain things, and those promises were denied. And I think the world would do right to stand by them, and it would be useful to ensure that the people of China understand what they were actually asking for, and to stand in solidarity with them as well.
You've already referred to the National Democratic Institute, which you lead now. Could you share a bit more about NDI's vision and ways of working, and particularly how you see NDI working on Hong Kong in this new chapter of the national security law? What are your plans going forward for NDI?
Well, just first on Hong Kong, we were in Hong Kong for about 15 years, had an office there. We're registered. I think we're still registered. I mean, even after all, we were sanctioned by Beijing and then got re-registered in Hong Kong. So it's not as if we're operating in the shadows. We never have. We've been around for almost 4 decades. We were established during the Reagan administration under the National Endowment for Democracy Act. There's a National Endowment for Democracy that is a funding agency. And we're affiliated with the Democratic Party. It's a party institute. There's also an International Republican Institute. We were modeled after the German Stiftungen, where they had party institutes that promoted democratic values around the world. And what we do is simply support democracy, democratic development internationally. That means supporting the infrastructure of democracy. We used to call ourselves years ago a political Peace Corps, but it was underwriting the development of political parties, or how parliaments function, and civil society development, how these different institutions interact. Processes of elections, election observation, election monitoring, so that people are confident that when elections occur, that it represents their will. But we don't do it with the idea of exporting the American model. Even though we're an American organization, we're affiliated with the Democratic Party. Very early on, the Institute decided that that wasn't right. There are a lot of different models of democracy. There are certain fundamental values of democracy, but there are different models that are practiced all over the world. We have a presidential system. Britain is a parliamentary system, for one. So we wanted to simply share the democratic experiences that countries had, the good, the bad, and the ugly, with those struggling to develop their own democracies. And that's what we've been doing for about 40 years. We find analogous situations with people that have gone through their own democratic transitions and sought to share those experiences with others. And in the process, show solidarity with their efforts. That this is hard. Democracy is hard. Democracy is never done. It is a process. It is fragile. It is never irreversible. And we all must be vigilant, but it is the best form of government that human beings have yet devised to defend human dignity. As difficult as it is, and as frustrating as it can be, and as imperfect as it always is, we strongly believe that not only is it best for human dignity, but also for international security and stability, because it creates more stable societies where people have a voice in their own affairs. So that's what NDI is about. And we work in partnership. We don't lecture, we share. We work in partnership, we don't dictate. And in that way, we have built networks through the whole world of small d Democrats, practitioners that are struggling, that are working on the same task.
Going forward, do you think that NDI will work increasingly with Hong Kong activists now in exile who have the freedom to try to continue the fight more openly, or, without obviously going into any details that you wouldn't want to go into, is there still a way that you can support people on the ground?
Well, we have to be very careful on the ground, because of the laws that say anyone who is affiliated or associated with external forces is not only suspect but criminal. So we're very mindful of that. People in the territory are very mindful of that. So I think our main task is true in a lot of closed societies, and now we can consider Hong Kong, unfortunately, a closed society like others around the world. you do have to figure out a way to keep fires burning a little bit. So I think the exiles who will be interested to continue to make the case and to represent people inside the territory, ensure again that the international community does not forget, and that information of what's going on is represented in the parliaments and in the halls of power around the world as well. I think we want to do our part, again, to show solidarity with those who were partners of ours for many years, simply partners so that they can enforce the basic law, so they can have a voice, they can run for local office, they can run for legislative council, all of this, LegCo. And these are all rights that are afforded to them, and we believe they're still enshrined in their basic law. And therefore, we feel, because we have these relationships, we would like to sustain that effort. So we will continue, yes, and we'll have to be creative in doing so.
On the subject of democracy and transitions, you have a new Democrat president and administration coming in, and I think that's now pretty clear. I think the world.
Clear. Yes, it is.
So I was wondering, what do you expect from, hope for, and recommend to President-elect Biden and the new administration as they, in regard to China and particularly Hong Kong policy, as they prepare for government?
Well, I don't know if they'll listen to me. I am a Democrat, but they have their own counsel. I know these people very, very well at the senior levels, the ones that have been announced. Tony Blinken is a good friend. Jake Sullivan is a good. I've worked and known them. I actually took over Tony Blinken's office at think tank CSIS when he worked for Biden. I mean, literally, so we've known each other, and I have absolute confidence in them. They're very smart, very practical, very experienced. And Tony, in particular, I think Jake too, but I've talked a lot more with Tony about commitment to values and democracy, the importance of it, not just in terms of humanitarian interests, or not even in terms of our values, but simply the fact that that democracy works, that it does create a more stable global community, and the recognition that we need to adhere to those values, to stay strong in support of those values, is deep within Tony, and I know within Jake. So I think when it comes to China and Hong Kong, they are very clear-eyed. They see what Hong Kong represents symbolically for what a rising China means. I believe they will not ignore Hong Kong or let it fall into the shadows. It will be on the agenda, as well as things like the Uyghurs and certainly Taiwan, attention to Taiwan. But I'd advise them that China is competing with us. They are openly. They've been doing it for decades, but now it's quite open. It is part of a zero-sum effort. They think zero-sum. They always talk about win-win solutions, but they've always thought in zero-sum terms in competition. And we have to simply recognize that. And the defining challenge, in my view, of this era now are what are the norms, values, and rules of the international system going to be in the coming century? We had a sense of that certainly after the Cold War ended, but even we had a sense of that fight during the Cold War, after World War II. It's now, and we've had institutions that reflected it, and those institutions remain. But China's out there with others to try to shape those norms, values, and rules according to its own self-interest, rather than the common interest. And we have to get out there and compete and challenge that. And that means a Hong Kong matters. That means Taiwan matters. All these things are representative of these values and these norms of how you deal with differences and how people should organize themselves. So I believe they understand that, and will deal with China appropriately. At the same time, they believe that there are things we should work together with China on in cooperation, like climate change or on pandemics or on a lot of the international non-proliferation, cross-border issues. I think that's absolutely right as well. The challenge, the art will be balancing the two. I think, again, that they are less of a mindset of rushing to China, seeing it all through cooperative lens and dismissing the competition. I think they recognize the competition in play. But that balance is the art of diplomacy and the art of leadership. And we'll see how they handle that. But I think I'm confident. I'm confident about them.
That's really interesting. So just building on that, there are some Hong Kongers, some Hong Kong activists, some of whom may be watching this interview,
Yeah.
who saw in the outgoing administration a real ally, both rhetorically and in some of the steps the administration took, sanctions and so on. It sounds like, but I just want to ask you to confirm this, that you can offer Hong Kong as a reassurance that the United States will still be with them under the new administration?
I strongly believe that. I mean, look at the Hong Kong Democracy Act. I mean, it's bipartisan. The support for Hong Kong in the US Congress and in the United States, and now I think it's around the world, is unanimous. And it's certainly in the United States, strongly bipartisan. This is an administration that has put democracy and human rights as a central pillar to its foreign policy agenda. So they cannot afford to let down Hong Kong. I'm not sure what more we can do to make change there, but in terms of solidarity and rhetoric and support generally, I have very strong, my personal belief, and I'm not in the administration, but I can provide a sense of reassurance that this is strongly felt in the United States. This is not a Trump administration thing. I think people likely saw quietly what President Trump had said about Hong Kong, and I worried about the future of American commitment to Hong Kong and what was being said to the leadership and what the leadership in Beijing heard about Hong Kong. But I feel now that we would be consistent both at the senior most levels of our government, as well as through the bureaucracy and into the US Congress, about our solidarity with the people there. And I really encourage Hong Kongers and others in the region who seem to think that this is a Republican and Democrat thing to reassess that, because it's simply not true.
Thank you. Just a couple more questions as we draw towards the conclusion. Looking at the democratic world more broadly, we talked about US policy, but what do you think the free world as a whole could do to better coordinate, unify, challenge, and even penalize the regime in Beijing for what it's done to Hong Kong, for what it's doing to its own people, and for the threats it poses well beyond its borders? Isn't it time now for the free world to stand together? And if so, what are your thoughts on how they can do that?
I completely agree. I mean, you talked about in your question, you sort of provide the answer. It has to be unity. There has to be a coming together on recognizing the challenge that we're facing. It's not, I mean, some countries say, well, we don't want to choose between the US and China. Or we need China, we have economic relations to that. Okay, fine. You have those are, China uses everything against countries. They see that economic relationship as a cudgel. They see it as leverage, but it's not a matter of choosing necessarily. You have to choose what type of values, what type of world do you want to live in? As what I talked about a moment ago. What are the norms? What are the rules of the international system? And recognize the cost of compromising on those for short-term interest. You start salami slicing these norms, these rules. Oh, well, it's just Hong Kong. It's part of China. What can you do about it? Those people were asking for too much. Beijing was never going to give that to them. All those lines that you start to, negotiate. One negotiates with oneself. You have to recognize this sends a signal about a rising China and what that's going to mean for your own security, for global security, and the environment in which your economic and political interests are going to be shaped. So, we need to be out there shaping together. Those who believe in different norms and values need to recognize what's at stake in this current moment, what's at stake in what has been signaled in Hong Kong, what's at stake in the challenge to Taiwan, what's at stake in what China is exporting and using its resources to try to shape internationally. See it for what it is, see what's happening, and challenge those norms and rules. Even if you don't want to challenge China directly, fine. It's not about China, it's what it's representing and exporting. Challenge those head on, without apology. And I think what the Biden administration is already doing when talking about a democracy summit and putting democracy at the center of its foreign policy is a recognition of precisely this fact, that this rise of authoritarian powers of their norms, of shaping by China and others. The Democracy Summit is not simply going to be about, or probably won't be about, the broader security environment. It will be about how do we support democracy? How do we support dignity and voice and human agency around the world? We need to come together, US, not just the US, but Japan. Taiwan should be part of this. The EU needs to be part of it. The UK needs to be part of it. Germany needs to be part of it. Those in the Southern Hemisphere, I mean, Tunisia can be part of it, and Sudan can be part of it, and you name it. Indonesia can be part of it. I mean, we're all flawed democracies. There is no perfect democracy, but we have certain values that we should be aspiring towards. There are certain norms and rules, and we have to come together and strongly define those and say, this is our agenda going forward, and that what China represents, not simply China, but what China represents, is not what we seek for the world of the 21st century. And we will challenge that. And there should not be any reservation about that. So far, we haven't. And I'll be very honest that the United States has been AWOL on that. We've obviously, gone out and supported Hong Kong as Hong Kong or the Uyghurs, but I was very much concerned that this was much more about China than it really was about Hong Kong. It was more about a US-China strategy than it was about people of Hong Kong or the people of Uyghurs and such. But I think we need to now, the United States has to come back. It has to exercise leadership about these places as in and of themselves important for the broader agenda of supporting democracy, human rights, freedom, and dignity worldwide. And finding that not just at the government level, but networking at the civil society level and all levels, women, young people, everybody, to push back for their rights, for their voice. And in that, Hong Kong is a part. And that's what we need to do.
Well, that leads me to my final question. You've spent much of your life working for democracy and freedom around the world, particularly in East and Southeast Asia. When you look at the struggle for freedom throughout human history, do you have any one particular figure anywhere in the world and at any point in time in history who most inspires you? And if you do, what would that figure have to say to Hong Kongers?
Well, there are a couple folks that they're heroes of mine. One who passed away this year, and one who's been, who's murdered, 50 years ago. I mean, Martin Luther King has always been a hero of mine, and his disciple or partner in this, John Lewis, who was a congressman in the United States, who just passed away this past year, who talked about good trouble, getting in good trouble. I mean, he got arrested, I don't know how many dozens of times he was arrested because he was breaking the law, as it were. But he felt he just had to do it. He had dedicated himself for his people. And I'm not telling anybody to do anything they're not comfortable with, but and there's enormous sacrifice in that. But they represented a kind of moral vigilance and remarkable staying power and rectitude in the way. I mean, they obviously weren't perfect human beings in all way, but what they represented, peaceful protest. Martin Luther King led to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, the things we're still fighting for in the United States, but he appealed to the moral center of the United States. And I have to believe there's a moral center even in those in China and elsewhere. It is harder to see, and I'm not suggesting a perfect analogy. There is no perfect analogy. But violence is not going to work either. I mean, given the power at the center, and that was the lesson, I think, was that that you have to fight overwhelming power with some kind of moral center. Without that, it's just great power against small power, and you lose. There's some remarkable, overwhelming power in doing what's right, and they've always been symbols of hope to me. And that's what NDI is about. And that's what we all do day to day, is live by that hope, but hope that comes with action and with vigilance and with fighting those who seek to control.
Well, that's a great way to end. I very much like the phrase "good trouble," and like you, so many people in my field of work inspire me for their pursuit of good trouble. I mean, we can take a moment just to remember again Jimmy Lai,
Yes.
who I spoke to just 2 weeks ago. He's a prime example of good trouble, and sadly he's in a lot of trouble now. But when I spoke to him 2 weeks ago, he was absolutely more determined than ever and more cheerful than I've ever heard him. And he probably knew what was coming, or maybe not immediately, but had some sense of what was coming. And yet he was standing firm. So yeah, the good troublemakers are our inspiration.
And Agnes
And
and Nathan
Agnes.
and all these folks. I mean, they're young people and they have their lives ahead of them. I will never forget them while they're still in custody. And I saw her as she was taken away. It is heartbreaking. These people are patriots. These people believe in their people, are giving up a lot simply to have a voice and make their lives better. And they don't deserve the fate that they're getting right now. And I just hope that I hope there's some change that comes in recognition of the power of these individuals to make things better for everybody, not just for themselves.
Absolutely. And I know that your organization, NDI, and Hong Kong Watch and others will keep doing everything we can to support such people.
Yeah, we will. It's an honor and a privilege. It truly is, and it is inspiring, but our hats are off to them.
Yeah, very much so. Well, Derek Mitchell, thank you so much for being our guest this week, and thank you for everything you're doing in this cause.
Thank you, Ben, very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thanks.